Okay, you were just talking about your father and the information.
Yeah, my father. I was telling you about being interested in past generations in history, and I wish that my father, like I said, he was 86 years old when he died, and I wish that I could have been more interested that got the stories, and I mean if nothing else just got a tape recorder and listened to what he had to say, because like I said, after he's gone, well, you can't bring all those things back. Daddy was the type of person that his sister wrote the book, but Daddy was the type of person that did it orally. You could sit down and he could keep you interested in talking for hours on end, not only just on that aspect of it, but just things that happened in his life and his parents' life and things like that. And he could just, he loved to talk. He loved to get people around. He loved to talk, and he just talking about, scary stories and about all. I think all black people had a problem with being afraid of ghosts and things like that. He could sit down and make a hair raise upon your head of the things that he did, and all those things, that we just took for granted. It's lost. It's gone now, and there's no way of ever getting it back. With not only him, but his sisters and his brothers, and of course, another thing about me, I never did know any of my grandparents. I only knew Daddy's father, and he was an old man when I got to know him. He died in 1958. I told you I graduated in 1958, and he had moved away, and he lived in Columbus, and he come back and lived with Daddy's sister, and I never really got to know him. But he was the type of fellow that, as Daddy would say, that had story after story after story, because that's the way people entertained themselves. That's the way they did. And people seems like at that time, whenever they would come, and we as kids, we was always sitting around and listening. You didn't get into conversation like kids do today, but you was always around listening. And they'd sit around for a while, and they'd talk about the weather and ask this and that and the other. And every time they'd always go into the ghost story. And man, I'll tell you, I've spent some miserable nights. I said, if I ever live through these times, and my children, if I ever are blessed to have children, I'll never ever put them through what I went through. And like I said, my mother, I didn't tell you about that, but she made quilts and things like that. We had summer quilts, spring quilts, winter quilts, and what have you. Had one quilt, I know that thing weighed 100 pounds. But the thing of it was, just like weather like we got now, and didn't have air conditioning, didn't have fans, didn't have any of that. But after you'd sit and listen to them ghost stories all night, then you had to go to bed. So you go to bed, and they turn off all the lights, all dark, and man, and everybody else in the house was asleep. You could hear them snoring, and you was in the bed. And like I said, we didn't have blankets, we didn't have sheets and things like that. We had quilts, and you'd be under the cover. And say like now, warm it is now at 80 nights, it'd be 80 degrees outside, and in the house with all the doors and the windows shut, it'd probably be 90. You're under that cover, and man, you talking about miserable. I have spent some miserable times. My nephew, he stayed with us, and he was 6 years younger than I would. Me and him slept together, and many a night, I'd have to pinch him to wake up to come out from under the cover to get some air. It would just be that bad. But anyway, whenever they would come, them old people would come, they'd always start in on those old stories of, somebody's seen this or somebody's done this. And man, kids, I'll tell you, they'd eaten up every bit of it. But now I look back on it now, and I see it for more or less entertainment. But back at that time, it was real. It was real. And like I said, whether they did or whether they didn't, I don't know whether they seen those things or not, but they could tell you stories that, man, I'll tell you that it was something. And don't let somebody die in the community. And you didn't have to know them. If you wanted somebody to have to say, they come, well, so and so died, and that was some more sleepless nights.
Why was that sleepless night?
Scared, ghosts. And not only that, but see, back at that time, I remember one time, for an example, my mother's uh, sister's husband died, the first thing he died, and I was probably 6, 7 years old, and they brought you back to the house. When you died, you didn't go to the funeral home and hold the wake. They brought the body back to the house, and that's where you sit. And there you sit up in the house with that dead body sitting up in there, and pretty soon people's going to go to sleep, and there you sit there with that dead body. And those things, we just, and I could just on that same story. Now, like I said, Daddy was up here in Morgan, and they owned 2 or 3 different places, but this particular place where they live, there was 26 or 30 families living, and they back over the hill from where they lived, wintertime, roads was bad, and of course they didn't have vehicles like we had now. They had horse and wagons that they brought the casket and the bodies and things. Of course, they didn't take the bodies back to the funeral home. They did it at the house. And the roads were so bad, Daddy said, that when they got to their house, they lived on the road and went by it. And the guy died, lived way back over in the field behind them. Well, the undertaker couldn't get the casket back over to it because the road was so bad. So they just unloaded the casket there in the yard. Daddy said you'd wake up at night, you know, and moon shining, and there you look out there in that casket laying out there in that yard. You know, and things like that for a kid, you know, that's scary, and it does. And, you know, just, and if they said, and of course, it don't bother me now, but Morgan, what they call Morgan, from the 160 side clear till you get to church, they said that was haunted from one end to the other. And man, I'll tell you, they could tell some stories up there that, and I never did live in Morgan, but the people who lived up there, man, it was miserable living, you know. And even after we got down there where it was, of course, like I said, we believed all the things that the old people told you, you know, because, you know, that's what, you know, they believed it, so you believed it too. And I'll tell you, I have spent some miserable times. At that time, I liked winter nights and summer days. Well, winter, you know, you could stay under cover. You know, you didn't get, man, it was terrible. But Daddy, he could tell you some story, and his father could even tell some things that even going far and beyond that. But those things are gone and lost now.
Do you remember any of the stories?
Oh yeah,
Can you
Daddy.
tell one?
Well, one that Daddy told, he was back when he was, and we've got a picture of Daddy and his family. Back when they grew up, and they lived down, well, where I told you my grandmother come, Buck Ridge. And down below that, there was another community, which was a white community where my grandfather lived when Daddy was growing up. And it's called a McCormick settlement. And they lived in an old house that set back off the road, and they called it the old Bruner place. That's what, you know, they tell you to distinguish where it was. And this place, I guess it was haunted, and that's when all the children was home, you know, and Daddy, he was probably 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. We've got the picture in there. And he said that house was so haunted. He said, well, the one that wrote the book, Bessie, and of course, Calvin's mother, Mabel, they was older than Daddy. And they slept upstairs. So they was laying up there one night, and of course, you had lamp lights. That's before electric or anything like that. And they had lamp lights, and said they went up there this night, and they laid up there in the bed, and said he was laying there, and said one of them turned over in the bed, and when he turned over, this white woman was laying in the bed with him, just laying there, just looking at him. So it scared them, and they come back downstairs and told her dad, said, you know, what they'd seen. Said, there's a woman we seen up there in the bed. And that house, I guess, man, it was haunted. So he said, well, you didn't see nothing. Said, I'll go up there and I'll stay up there. So he said he went, Daddy said, so he said he went up there and said he got in the bed up there. And said when he got in the bed, said he just left the lamp burning, you know. And said, put the cover up on him, and said something would pull the cover off of it. So he'd pull the cover up and something would pull it off. And said finally, the lamp, said something would blow the light out. He'd light the lamp, something would blow it out. So finally he just got the point, said he's just going to leave the lamp off. He wasn't going to light it no more. Of course he wasn't sitting that on like he wasn't scared. So he said finally he just left the lamp off, and said the thing finally just got up on him and just blowed down in his face. And said he finally come back downstairs, and he asked him, well, why come you didn't stay up? He said, oh, said the bed bugs are so bad up there that I just couldn't stay. But whatever it was up there, he said it was just, it was just that, and now whether that's true or whether it's not, I don't know, but that's the story that they told. But they could tell, and Daddy said another time down there, he was a little boy, and he told this for the truth. And back when he was 10, 11, 12 years old, and said he had an outside toilet. Said he'd eat a bunch of green apples and he had to go out to use the toilet. So he was sitting out there and said, moon shining bright, and said there was something, said he didn't know what it was, and he never found out to this day. But it just sounded like something just took a rock as big as this house and just rolled it down over that hill. You just hear it rolling, boom, 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 boom. And said, man, he jumped up from there and took off back to the house. Said he never did see the rock, he never did see anything, but he just, whatever it was, he said the house was just so bad that you couldn't stay into it. Now I've never, only thing that I've ever seen that I couldn't make out is me and my wife, and she'll verify this for herself. We lived down there where we used to live before we moved up here. And there was a creek that went right alongside the house. It wasn't as big as this creek. And we was out there one night, it was about dusk dark. And we was burning, wasn't a brush pile, we had trash that we was burning. And we just stand out there around the fire. And behind the house, there was about a half, 3/4 of a mile, just what we call a bottom. There's woods on both sides and just strip of land that went down between it. And we was standing there at that fire that night. And like I said, it wasn't late, it wasn't dark. And of course, we didn't have outside lights when we got here, but it was dark. And there was something come up through that, what we call that, up through them woods. And you could actually hear that thing tearing the trees out by the roots. Now this is honest God truth. You can ask her, she heard the same thing. And it actually got so close that we could hear that thing breathing. Whatever it was, now I don't know what it was. And it just acted like it, just like to hear them, see them prehistoric monster movies, you know, and that's the way that thing was. You could just hear it coming. It was just tearing trees out by the roots, just, you know, just, and it got so close to us. And I never said nothing to her, and she never said nothing to me. And he just got there and just quit. Never heard no more. There wasn't a tree that fell. There wasn't anything that happened or nothing. And we both of us heard that. But other than that, I've
When
never.
you went outside, there was no tree.
Well, I never said nothing to her. We never left. We stayed there at the fire. And she never said nothing to me, whether she heard it or I never said nothing to her. But after we got talking out later, she heard the same thing that I did. And up here in Morgan, and also at the little community down on Buck Ridge. Now they've had a thing up there. I don't know what it was, but it was something that one of Daddy's nephews, lived down on Buck Ridge down there. And he was a bad man. He was mean. He stood about 7 foot, you know, and he's mean, carried a gun. And he was coming down over the hill, and Buck Ridge is up on a hill if you've never been up there. And this thing was laying in the road, just looked like a big dog or whatever it was. And he cussed, you know, said, I'll blow your brains out. Man, that thing jumped up from there and took off after him, and they lived down over the hill, and this thing had big red eyes. And he took off after him. Like I said, he was mean, had a gun, you know, and he run down to the house. And when he went to the house, he was hollering for his father to open the door. You know, open the door, Paul, open the door, open the door. This thing was after him. And he got down to the house. When he get to the door, well, this thing, to let him in, the thing would act like it was coming. So the man would have to slam the door. And he couldn't, so he'd have to go around the house 2 or 3 times, you know. And finally, his dad told him, said, run down and turn the dogs loose. He run down and turned the dogs loose and said, just like we said with that thing we heard, said that thing, them dogs took that thing up over that hill, and it sounded like that thing was just tearing the trees out by the roots. And there's been a lot of people that's seen that thing, you know, whatever it was. The same thing's been seen up here in Morgan, and like I said, whatever it was, we heard it down there. Now what it is, I don't know, but it right now it just makes the cold chills go over, you know, just to do it. But that's some of the folklore that was in these black communities that was around here.
Does it have a name?
I don't know. We never did name it. We never did. Of course, like I said, other than him seeing it, I don't know anybody else that ever seen it. But he seen it, and it had big red eyes, you know, and there was another guy that had seen it, and he was scared. He was an old man. He's still scared when he died, and he said that he was coming down from Buck Ridge up there, and said he seen the darn thing, and he carried a gun, and said that time, you know, they didn't have cars, and said this guy come along, him and another guy on a horse, and they lived over on another community over across the road over there. So they come down through there and asked him what was wrong. He said, well, he just didn't seen that thing up there, and said, well, said, you want to get on a horse and ride? He said, no, said, I'll just run along beside it. Or he figured if that thing come, he wouldn't fool with no horse. But he told that, you know, for the truth. And like I said, but like up here in Morgan, they have seen things from the hard road clear to the church. There was a white preacher that supposedly, now he didn't tell me that come down through there, and there was a casket just went floating right across the road in front of it. Now they told that for the truth. Now whether it is or not, I don't know. But but it's supposed to be haunted up there, just, you know. But there's been a lot of things, and like I said, my grandfather up here where he lived, he after his wife died, he stayed up there in that house, and said the first night he stayed there, and said this thing, he heard it when it come in the house downstairs. He said the next night, said he heard it walking around down in the house, and said he's sleeping upstairs. Nobody there but him. All the kids was gone. And said finally the next night he come, said it started up the stairs. And said the next night when it comes, said he got clear to the top of the stairs. Heard it when it come up, heard it when it come in the house. Got clear to the top of the stairs. And when it got up there and evidently looked and seen him, said that thing went back down the stairs out the door and never heard no more of it. No, that was the story. That's what he said. Now, but you just take a kid, you know, when you're young, you know, and you're sitting around listening to that stuff. I'll tell you, man, it was some miserable time. But but it's good. It's good folklore. It's good stories. And like I said, I guess every community had something like that, you know.
I still have a few questions to ask you because you still haven't talked about the Lamberland.
Oh, gee.
But before we go on to that, what kinds of illnesses did family members experience when you were growing up?
You mean terminal or?
No, just any.
Well, that was another thing when I was growing up, and I heard Cora say when you was interviewing her. But when I was growing up, my parents took me and got me, how can you say, around where every childhood illness there was. Measles, chicken pox, mumps, whooping cough, all those kind of things. Now they don't want you to have them, but back at that time they did. If you, in order to get it before you got older, because it was easier as a child to have it, and they'd expose you to it. Now we did. I had every illness was going on. In fact, 3 days measles. I don't know whether you ever heard of it. I don't know what anyway. 3 day measles. Now you can get to what they call the rubella, I think it is. One time, and that does that. You don't get them no more. But the 3 day measles, you can get them 100 times. And I've had them things, you know, of sensitive skin. I've had them things a dozen times, you know. But all the rest of the illness, you know, I did. I had them all, you know. And I don't know of any of them that I didn't have. Like I said, you probably never had chicken pox. Have you had them? Well, you know what that is. Whooping cough. You ever had the whooping cough? Never had that. You know what the whooping cough is? Well, you don't know what it is. Well, anyway, it's just what's called whooping cough. You coughed, and you'd cough so much you finally you just threw up, you know. But it was just a childhood illness that went around, and measles and mumps and things like that. You ever had the mumps? Never had the mumps either. You know what the mumps are? Well, all right. Yeah. Well, I've had all of that, and like I said, you know, they exposed you to it when you was young, and you didn't have to worry about it after you got old. Because after you got older and got them, it was harder on you. You know, it was something that you didn't want after you got older. But other than that, now I'll tell everybody, just like Alzheimer's that we have today, and a lot of the things like that. The older people might have had it, but I don't remember anybody ever having, you know, the extent that it is today. I just don't remember it. It may have been, but I don't remember it ever being that way. Of course, you know, they used to talk about people that had heart attacks. So you didn't say the heart attack, you just say, well, so-and-so dropped dead this morning. Evidently, they had a heart attack, but they never really associated with that. Of course, now, you know, today, too, people are living longer, you know. And that's another thing. Daddy, he used to, when he was a boy, of course, you always had to go to work someplace, and they lived on up a road, and there was this other man that lived down the road. He lived right along the road, and he was sick. The old man was sick. And Daddy said that morning when he went by, he was going, old woman he went to work for over there, she taught school, and he had to get up way before daylight and go over and harness up her horse and hook it up to the buggy so she could go over here in White Lady and have to teach school over here in Morgan Center. So he said that morning went by there way before daylight and said he knew that old man was sick. And said when he went by that house that morning, said he looked over at that house and there wasn't a light on in that house nowhere. But he'd seen that old man, he had his bed right there beside the bed, right beside the window. And said he'd seen that old man just eat, you know, like an old man does, you know, getting up and looked out the window at him. And said when he come back, well, they told him the old man was dead. But said he saw that old man just as plain as day, just get up, you know, and raise up out of the bed and look out there out the window at him. Now, another thing that happened to me, and I'm not going to tell no more of these kind of stories. Now, I told you I'd never seen anything, but back when I was a boy, or a little kid, and we moved into Porter when I was 2 years old. Now, I had a tricycle, and I was probably, that's before I ever started school. I was probably 4, somewhere 5, somewhere. But I was always somewhere on that tricycle. I didn't have no business. Right down 2 houses below us down there was a family lived there, a man and a woman, and she died. And I was down there, had an alleyway, went all around through Porter, and it went right by their house, come around, circle back where we live. And I was down there on my tricycle, and there wasn't nobody in that house. And I used to go down there and take an old man, used to go down with him to milk. And I was sitting down there on my tricycle. Didn't have a bit more business down there than a man in the moon. And I looked over at that window, and there was a blind up there. And I seen a hand come up and wave at me in that blind, just as, boy, and you talking about getting away from there. Now, like I said, it might have been my imagination, it might not have been, but whatever it was, I saw it with my natural eye. But those are just, now I'm not going to tell no more of that kind of stuff. You asked me your question.
How about colds and other things? What are some home remedies that were used when you were growing up?
I never used too many home remedies, but my mother knew them all. She come back and stayed with us after she got older. Bone set. She could go out and she could pick bone set, and some of the things that we used to take when we was growing up. She used to make a thing with rock candy. You've heard of that? Whiskey. You go to the drugstore and you get rock candy. I don't know, you ever heard of rock candy? Well, okay. You'd mix it with whiskey and I don't know what all they'd put in it, but you take it like a cough syrup. And but as far as herbs and things like that, now she'd go out and she'd get different kind of herbs, and man, just looked like, I don't know, just black as tar and bitter as gall, and she'd take that stuff and pretty soon she'd come out of it. But I never did learn all that, but there was a lot of home remedies that went around, a lot of things that, you know, that you could use for cure. This is another thing that happened with her back when I was, now whether you believe this or not, I don't know, but it's actually happened, and whether it had anything related to it or not. My mother somewhere or another, I don't know what she did, I don't know how she did it now, but she cut herself awful bad. And she couldn't get the blood stopped. When I come home from school, man, the blood was just, you know, it wasn't pouring, but it was just something that she couldn't get stopped from. So my dad was working for a guy that lived up here on this road here, over on the other side of the hill. And his name was Maxino. Now his wife went up there to get Daddy, and that's who Daddy was working for, to tell him, you know, that she was bleeding. And so the woman heard me when I told him, you know, and she said, whatever it was, she used a verse out of the Bible, and she read that verse, and said, when you go home, that blood will be stopped. And it was. Now,
who was this woman that read the?
her husband's name was Maxino, and I think her name was, shoot, I can't remember what her name was, but anyway, that's been 50 years ago.
Were they African American?
No, there was a white couple. But there's a verse in the Bible that you read somewhere out of Isaiah that's supposed to do it. Now, like I said, I don't go in for, you know, for those kind of things. But she read that, and we got home. The blood had stand. Whether the blood had just quit on its own or whether it didn't, I don't know. But I'm just telling you what I seen.
How often would you see a doctor growing up?
Only time I really went to the doctor, toothaches, get a tooth pulled. Of course, when I think I was in probably the 4th or 5th grade of school, I got something in my eyes, and I spent some time in the hospital. You know, I went blind, I guess you might say, and I went in there and they give me antibiotics and got that. But other than that, you never went to the doctor for checkups or anything like that. Like I was telling you, my dad, he was ruptured on both sides for 30 years. You know, he never went to the doctor until you know, that he retired, and got Social Security and things like that, and he went. And I remember one time he was working on a sawmill, and a slab hit him and cut his eye, and he went and had that sewed up. But other than that, only time you went to the doctor was just you got a arm or a leg cut off or something like that, or you got. And we had a doctor, had a practitioner, and he was in Gallipolis, and he would come out in the country and doctor you. But as far as going to the doctor, nobody very seldom ever did.
How about when you hurt your finger?
Well, I had to go. Well, when I cut my finger off, that's when you're talking about. The guy working for him, we went to the practitioner, and he parked over on the street behind it, and I'm walking there holding my hand in a rag. We went up to this practitioner and got up there and sat out there in the waiting room for about an hour, and went in there, and he said, I can't do nothing with that. So I had to leave out of there and walk across the street to the hospital, and we went over there, and they cut it off. It was about that much sticking, or just a bone sticking out there, but that just about that much hanging on it. But you know, that was a have-to case. You know, had to do that. But other than that, no, you didn't go to the doctor.
How did you learn about slavery growing up?
Didn't know much about slavery. In fact, you know, just like I said, I don't know whether it was taboo or something that they didn't want to talk about. I just like my dad. Now, he talked about everything else, and he never ever talked about, you know, the Lambert lands, or we heard the traditional story, you know, about the three brothers and things like that. But the true story, we never knew that. Even clear up, and the only way that we found out the real story was when we started research for the monument. That's the only way we found out about it. But I can't understand why they didn't, because for the simple reason was that Daddy's brother, which was William White Miller, which was one of the three brothers, was Isham's three sons. He didn't die till 1943. Now I'm sure, or I would have thought, that surely that they would have asked their father where they come from, or what happened, how did they get. I'm almost certain that they did. But and like I said, when Bessie wrote the book, now she was old enough to know that man. Daddy was old enough to know him. And they was all old enough to know him, and I'm sure that surely that somebody would have had to told them of what it was. But evidently, I don't know. And whether that was just a good story that they wanted to stick to, and they was going to stick to it, whether or not, I don't know. But I do know that he didn't die till 1943, and somebody should have known the story. Now, Daddy's father, his name was Powell, and he fought in the Civil War. And there was another brother, which was William. See, all of them brothers had children and children's children. They all lived in Morgan, and or what we called Morgan. And like I said, they grew up there until later years, until they just finally moved off. But I just can't understand that they didn't tell. And whether they didn't talk about slavery, I don't know. I don't know what. But Daddy, I don't remember as much as stories that he's told. Don't remember him ever telling anything about slavery. I don't remember him ever saying anything about it.
So how did you learn about slavery?
Well, like I said, I really didn't. I knew what slavery was, but as far as teaching it in the schools, I didn't. We didn't learn it in school. You know, nobody taught it, and anything of that nature. But I don't know. Really, like I said, I never really got into the aspect of what slavery and Underground Railroad and things like that was until, well, well, here in the later years, it become a movement, I guess. After, more or less, I think people got interested after Roots come out. I think that's pretty well what got people more aware. And I think that people got to, at that time, what it did, it opened your eyes up and let you see that everybody had a history. But up until that time, I don't think anybody, especially in our neck of the woods, had ever really thought anything about slavery. I don't. I don't know of anybody that really was even interested in it.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about what you know about the Lambert lands, just the history behind it, the old myth and the new myth? And
Well, the old myth, as we've said, there's been Columbus Dispatch has written several articles on it. Our Aunt Bessie, she wrote that little old book about it, and it was all the myth. You can go back as far as clear back till even before Sands come along in some of the old Tribune stories that they have written about the Lambert land, and they all told the same story. Three brothers, Miller, Menace, and Frank Lambert, three brothers, brought slaves to Gallia County, bought 265 acres of land, and put them on it. And but that was the myth. And how, like I said, I don't know why. And another myth of the story was that made the story so hard to trace was that they've always told us, and I've heard Daddy say it, and I've heard the whole family say it, that we came from not Bedford County, but we come from Fairfax County. Fairfax County is clear down, you know where that's at, down next to D.C. We went down there to a church, and they did a lot of research on black history, and I give them all the information I had and told them to get in contact with me if they ever needed anything else. Never heard a word from them. The reason was that it wasn't there. And the only way that we actually found out of where we come from is when we started with the monument project, and we got to looking around, and we found that everything, of course, like I said, I told you before, that there wasn't any need in looking for the Millers because there were so many of them. But with the Menaces, you know, there weren't that many. That's not a very common name. And every time we'd look, and in all of the documents we'd find that the name of Cali Hill Menace, which was the white man, would come up. And every time it would come up, it wasn't in Fairfax County, Virginia, but it was in Bedford County. So we got to thinking, well, evidently that the roots of some sort has to begin in Bedford County. So we went to Bedford County, and that's where we found the true story. But where Frank, now Frank is the first name on the will that they've had in Gallia County in the courthouse. And evidently that by that people thought that he was the slave owner. But after we did our research, we found that Frank wasn't an owner, he was a slave. Now where Frank went to, there's no records in the old minutes that we have or anything that we found, whatever happened to Frank. We don't know where Frank went. Somebody seemed to think that he went up in towards Albany and he raised a family up there, but we don't know. We've often thought about going up there and trying to find it, but we don't know where Frank went or any of his offspring or whatever happened to him or not. But the biggest majority of them that come from Bedford County, most of them stayed in that area up there. Some of them went off to different places, but Frank is the only one that I know that really don't know where he went. And then of all the rest of them that come, as I think that my wife's already told you, they already had their names before they left Bedford County, Virginia. And on the deed, which we found in Bedford County, they were listed with Millers and Menaces and Lamberts and there were no Higginbottoms. But there was plenty, there was other names that was mentioned, and when they come, they all brought their names with them. But when they come and they did the deed here in Gallia County, they didn't list them as the names that they had in Virginia, but they listed them under Lamberts, every one of them. And there was only 2 or 3 out of the bunch, other than Frank, that actually kept the Lambert name. The rest of them, when they kept their own name. And I don't know, they always said that we took the first name of the 3 brothers, Miller, Menace, and Frank. No, it wasn't true, but they had their names before they ever left.
So Frank Menace?
No, Frank Lambert. Frank Lambert.
He's
Frank.
the one that was a slave.
He was a slave, but people thought that he was a slave owner. They said Frank Lambert, Miller Lambert, and Menace Lambert. But there was other names that after we went and looked at the deed, found the deed, other than just Millers and Menaces and Lamberts. There was several different other names on there. Some of the, none of them was married, none of them had any husband. Some of them had children, some of the women had children. The oldest one was 80 years old, and the youngest one to come was 5 months old. And all of them, when they come out of the 265 acres, had like I said, they all owned it in communion. And then after they finally got to the point where they wanted to get married and branch off, then they were sectioned off and given places of their own. But when they came, all of them that come lived in a big communal house. They all had the same address, and that's one thing when we went to Columbus and did research that when they looked them up, that they all had the same address. Well, why? Well, the reason was because we thought that they had families when they come, but we found that they didn't. They weren't any of them married, and they got married here. They married. If you look at some of the documents that we had, most of them or all of them took their wives after they got here. Isham, he married Scruggs, wasn't it? And she, we found to run reference on her, she was from Gallia County. And so by that, and the myth, I don't know, I just don't know. But one thing that I would have liked to have known, and we have thought about it, and probably we should have already done it, or we should do it in the near future, is to find some of the Lamberts that were, I'm talking about the slave owners, that were left, and see how much they know about the story. Why he did what he did, or what possessed him to do it. Now, I don't know, maybe some of the children that they had, maybe they were his. I don't know. But I do know that some of the women had children, you know, and they had the Lambert name. Now, whether that they were his offspring or whether they wasn't. But why he got all these different people in that had different names and put money and everything that he had aside to bring them to the free land. See, this was before the Civil War. You know, this is 1843 when they come here. He actually started this in 1839. Man, why he did what he did, I don't know. And that's what I would like to do. I'd like to find some parts of that Lambert family and communicate with them and find out just how much they know. Whether they even know about us or not, I don't know. But I'd like to be able to do that.
So you said
Communal, everybody lived in, had the same address until they got married. And like I said, there were some of them as old as 80, and the children, well, some of them was young as 5 months old. And they lived all in the communal housing. And like I said, all of them had their names, and they all that came got their wives from this general area.
And so how big was this communal house? Was it still standing?
No. I don't even know where it was. The only thing I know with the documents that we found in Columbus at the state, historical, I guess. I don't know, it wasn't historical. I think it's like the courthouse, where all your records from all over the state of Ohio, your death records, your birth records, and all those things goes into the state house in Columbus. And well, anyway, she said it was, but I said no, she wasn't there. But anyway, when you got up there, that at that particular time, they all had the same address. Now, where this house was, I don't know. But I do know that after they got married, then they all had their own plot, so many acres. Now, where Chesterhill, Calvin's grandfather or great-grandfather, they had 30 acres that they belonged. Now, that was on the Lambert lands. Now, what happened there, according to the court records that we found here in Gallia County, one of the offsprings of the original contested it, and they wanted to strike their part of all. So they went to the court and they sued within the court, and they struck off 30 acres. And that's the reason that 30 acres, if you look at the map, that there's a section there that's cut off. And the reason that they did that was that this person contested it, and they wanted their own 30 acres. Now, when they did that, my grandmother and grandfather, some way or another, they bought it, the 30 acres. And they bought it off, didn't bought it off the slave, or the offspring of the slave, but they bought it off of some white guy. And they said, now this is just hearsay, but I can't understand how that had happened. But anyway, they paid for the land, but they never did get a deed for it. Now, Calvin's parents, and they stayed there clear through, they grew up, raised a family, stayed there for, I know, they had to be 20 or 30 years. never paid a dime's worth of taxes. The man never let on like that he owned it. But when they moved out, he claimed the land, and the land went back to him. And his name was Ward. And 30 acres right now, they got it for sale up there, and I think they're asking about what $35,000, $40,000 for it. But that was that part of it. But my grandparents were supposed to have bought the land. They give that 30 acres to Calvin's parents. Right down below there, where I was born in the log cabin, they owned that, which was a part of that. The schoolhouse sat across the road, and they bought the other place down there, which had 60 acres on it. But that 30 acres, some way or another they paid for the land, but some way or another that the will was never went through the court, and when they moved off of it 30 years later, that he come back and claimed the land. So that's
On the Lambert land.
they well, after so long a time, my grandparents finally moved and went to Columbus, and they sold it. No, they didn't. What they didn't sell it. They gave it to my dad, and my dad had done bought a place down in Porter, and he lived down there, and his sister and her husband and their family lived on the 60 acres. Well, Daddy, since he figured that Daddy was the type of person that didn't like a whole lot of obligations, so he said, well, since they're living on the place, that he would just sign the place over to them. 60 acres of land, he signed over to them. So it belonged to them, according to the record. So what they did, they sold that and bought them a place down in Porter. So the 60 acres is still up there, and now the last count I had of that, they was asking about $60,000, $70,000 for that. But it actually, after my grandparents left and went to Columbus, it actually belonged to my father. But being the kind of man that he was and didn't want a whole lot of responsibility and something that he was going to have to look after, well, he just thought the best thing since they lived there was to sign it over for them. And of course they sold it, and we don't have any part other than where we're buried in Morgan Cemetery that ties us to the Lambert land. Where, that's what I'm saying, all of these pockets of land that was black owned here in Gallia County, which was, I would say, if you'd figured up, it would go up into hundreds and probably thousands of acres, and none of it's all lost, it's all gone. And that was one thing that I said, that when we started this project of this monument in Morgan Bethel, I always said, and of course at that time when it was sold, I couldn't afford to do it, but I often said if I would have had the resources, that I would have never let it sold. But the only problem with that would have been, unless it would have went through the court system, that no one Miller, Menace, or anybody else that was tied with the original bunch could have ever owned it. You could have went and paid the taxes, but everybody would still had their, could have come back and still lived on it, rent-free or whatever, if they would have wanted to. Nobody could have owned it if you just paid the taxes on the complete set. But like I said, it went through the court, and then it was, you could have bid on it over the court, and you could have got it that way. But I often said if I would have had the resources of being able to do it, that I'd have never let it ever done. So this lady that in the later years, and I don't know how we got together, but she come along and she thought about, doing something. And I told her, I said, that was always been a dream of mine, of always to do something for the Lambert lands. And we started, and like I tell everybody, when we started, we never had anything. And we really didn't know what we wanted to really do, just to do something to let people know that it actually existed. Because, that's history. And it's Gallia County history, and it's state history. And it goes clear back to 1700 into Virginia. And it's a story that it needed to be told. And we thought that we would do it. And me and her, we went to businesses in Gallup, and we raised, what, $20-some thousand in probably 6 months or 8 months to build the monument. And you'll have to go up and look at it. It's got all the names of all of those that are buried in Morgan Bethel that doesn't have a monument, plus the original ones that come from Bedford County. And also, that's something else that I didn't know, and I didn't know this until we started this project. I didn't know that my great-grandfather fought in the Civil War. I didn't know that. And when we started this, well, the veterans came in and they got all new monuments and put up there's a lot of Civil War soldiers that's buried in Morgan Bethel. I didn't know that. There's one up there that was in the Navy that was fought in the Civil War. I didn't know any of this stuff until we started that project. And now we've got it, documented, and we've got a state marker put up for that, and it's on the map.
Do you know if any involvement that people who lived on the Lambert lands or associated with Morgan Bethel had with helping other escaped slaves or free black people move into Ohio?
I would say, yeah, I would, because like I said, it was the Underground Railroad was running strong before our bunch ever come here. You know, they were, the citizens that lived down in Porter, they were Underground Railroad workers. There were other people, and they were all involved. In fact, when the executors come here to buy the land, they dealt with the Underground Railroad that was in Porter. They already had the black people that were in Morgan that were already within the framework of the Underground Railroad. In other words, it went through there. And I don't know why, and that's another part of the story that we don't know that I would love to find out. Might be a good college thing for a college or university to research. But anyway, of why that they come clear from Bedford County, Virginia, to come to Ohio to buy 265 and a half acres of land right here at this particular place at that particular time. I don't know why. Now, I don't know whether that Charles Lambert was tied in with the Underground Railroad system, and he knew about the Sissons, he knew about the Summers, and he knew about the people that were working within the framework of the Underground Railroad in this area of why he come. But there had to be something that drew them to this area to do that. Another reason that I think that it had to be that way was that living this close to the river. See, we're only about 10, 12, 15 miles from a river. At that time, West Virginia was part of the state of Virginia. They would come across the river, the patrollers, and they would, if you didn't have papers to say that you was free, and if you had papers and they caught you, they'd take you back. But the thing of it is, why that if they were concerned about that, they would, looks to me like they went on further north, away from the Ohio River and away from as close to the Confederate States as they did. But they didn't. They come and they settled right here, and this is where they stayed. I'd love to know why they did it. I don't know, but that's just one of the mysteries that's associated with this. It's a great story to be true. In fact, if a person could really research it and do it right, you could make it as big as Roots. It's just that involved. And from those 26 families that come here, I don't know how many generations, I don't know how many generations, but I don't know how many of the offsprings that have branched out and went to places that, see how excited you got me? You know, how that we have grown. But we have grown and we've survived and we've lived. And we've prospered and we've come this far, but just from what that one man did in Bedford County, Virginia. And I'd like to know as Paul Harvey said, I'd like to know the whole story. Questions?
Yeah, I think that's it. Unless you have something else, is there anything you'd like to add that I haven't asked you?
Like I said, that would be one of my dreams. I'd just love to hear the whole story. I'd love to do that. And I don't know, like I said, now whether you're dealing with the university or whether you don't, I would love to see that kind of project taken up within an organization that has the time and the effort and to be able to research it the way it should be. We know where Charles Lambert's buried, but there's no markers. You know, we just know where he's buried. The graveyard, but there's no marker put there that tells that he's actually in that.
Now, are the Lamberts still living in Bedford County? Or
We do know that there was one woman that was associated with the Lamberts that lived somewhere in California. Before we went to Bedford County, she had already been there and she had done research on the Lambert family. And we've still, I assume we do someplace, have her address in California. And I don't know how old a woman was, whether she's still alive now or what, but that's the only one that I actually know. I do know that Charles had two other brothers. I do know that they had children. I do know that he had a daughter, and evidently she married and she had a family. I would say that some of them are still in and around Richmond, Virginia, because see, at that time, Bedford County was kind of like the High Company. You know, at one time, we didn't have counties broke up like you do now, but it was one big high company. And Bedford County went from where the county seat of Bedford is clear to Richmond. And that's where Charles is buried. He's buried clear almost up to Richmond, where the state capital is. And so that lets me know that it's a big deal. And all the other counties that's come off of that now are broke off into different counties. But at that time, Bedford County was took in that whole general area. But that would be one of my dreams. I would love to, and maybe we can go back down to Virginia, but we've pretty well, the only thing that we could actually do would be, I would love to find out where the plantation was, you know, where his property was, and and things like that, and maybe some way of get in touch with I'd like to get in some of the slaves that he left in Virginia that he didn't bring. Some of them are documented within our deed that one of them was burnt bad, feet got frostbite, he couldn't walk, he was left there. There was other that were left in Bedford County that didn't get to come. I'm sure that they've got offspring. I'm sure they've got children somewhere in and around Bedford County, Virginia. And of course, like I said, at that time when we was down there, we were both working, and you can only go down and stay for a certain amount of time. But I'd love to go back down there and get into it more in depth than what we have. We've learned a lot, but still there's more of the story to be told.
So what's the closest city to Bedford? Is it Richmond?
No. Bedford, I'd say that's probably 75 or 100 miles from Richmond. So there's other cities towns around. Bedford, the town of Bedford, just by looking at it, the only place that we actually got to was right where the courthouse was. It looks like that might have a population of maybe 15, 20,000 people, if that many.
So it's located in south.
Well, I would say kind of southwest of Richmond. Just from off the top of my head, I would think it would. I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. But it's a beautiful story, and I think it would be I think it could be as big as Roots if a person really wanted to look at it. And they tell me that now they've got things now where you can, even with Roots, you can go clear on back beyond 1700. I'd love to, if nothing else, just come to the understanding of why he had to go out and gather up all those slaves from other plantations, because if it had been his, then they would have kept a Lambert name. So that lets me know that why he went out and gathered them all up with Spots and all them, different names that he had. That he just acted like he gathered them up, and then after he got them gathered up, he knew he was going to die, and he wrote his will. And after he wrote his will, he wrote this will, I think, was in probably the summer or the fall, and he died before Christmas.
So he went to other plantations?
I'm just saying that he did. I don't know. I can't understand if he didn't, where he got all those other names of those slaves. Because the only slaves that when they got here that kept a Lambert name was no more than 3 or 4. Now, like I said, there were some of them that stayed down there. I don't know what their names was. But the ones that come here, that there was only out of the 26 individuals that come, that there was only about 3 or 4 that actually kept the Lambert name. The rest, well, Frank Lambert. Well, Frank and their children was Lamberts, or her children. She had children, the old woman.
But none of them the women that had children didn't have husbands when they
came? No. And that's why I say I don't know whether they were his children or where they come from, but why that he did it. But he did. He sold everything that he had, even down to the knives and forks and the spoons. And the only thing he left his daughter, he left her property, and his wife that he had, that his father cut out of the family even before that happened, from divorce or whatever she did. I don't know, but
so Charles was married to a woman.
Yeah, she was still living, but in order to so she wouldn't contest the will, it went through. Then they give her $1 that she wouldn't contest the will, and she let it go. But his father wrote her out way before this time, back in his will, which was in 1790, I think it was.
And where did you find this information about the
in Bedford?
Getting $1?
It's in the will, where when you go probate it through the court, if anybody contests it, you have to. But they, in order for her to contest the will and to make it so that she wouldn't go against it, they had to give her $1 for her part of not contesting the will. So they give her $1. And
what was her name?
Huh? Nancy. Was that her name?
Can you say it so it will be on
Nancy. That's what she said. I assume. I don't remember. I was thinking it was something else, but it's in the documents that we have.
Well, is there anything you'd like to add?
That's just about. I think I've run out.
Well, thank you very much.
Anything else that